All right, folks, I am in your new packet on polar, which you should have retrieved out of your folder. And I want to get right down to business here and scoot into page 5, which is all about plotting points. So I think before we actually get down to business and start plotting some points, we should talk a little bit about what the polar system is. Each point in the polar system is going to be determined by some distance from the pole, which is going to be the radius, and some angle measured from the polar axis, which we're going to think about as being the positive x-axis in the traditional xy coordinate plane. So if I'm thinking about what this looks like in terms of the picture, pole is going to be the center of your circle. Polar axis is going to be what would be the positive x-axis. And I've drawn both in red on this page for you already. Again, each point is going to be named using some radius r and some angle theta. Now, when we go to graph, there are a couple different ways in which you can do this. I'm going to tell you right now, if you're doing these and doing them for a long time, this is going to be easier if we plot the angle first. So I'm going to say find the angle first. And again, finding the angle first is just going to make your job a lot easier. I'm going to go draw some angles in here. I have the ability to erase pretty quickly and easily. You don't necessarily have that, so you may not want to draw your angles in there. You might just want to follow along with me as I draw them for you. So plot and label the points on the polar graph provided. Letter A says our radius is 2, our angle measure is 30. I'm going to go plot that angle first, or draw that angle first. So that angle is always going to be measured from the positive x-axis, or the polar axis. So if I want to go 30 degrees, I'm going to go 30 degrees up from that polar axis. So there would be my 30-degree angle. And on that 30-degree angle, I want my radius now to be 2. So I'm going to go to my pole, and from the pole, I'm going to count outwards from the pole 2 units. So that right there, letter A, would be the representation of the point with radius 2 and angle measure 30 degrees. Not bad, right? Not too terrible. Okay, I'm going to kind of erase everything to make it so that our picture is a little uncluttered. You're probably going to want to leave your A right in there. Letter B, go plot the point whose radius is 1 and whose angle measure is 3 pi over 4. So I'm going to think about 3 pi over 4. First of all, I'm back in my world of thinking about things in pi over 4s. So pi over here is going to be 4 pi over 4. This is going to be 2 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 is going to be exactly halfway in between, or right up the middle. So there's my 3 pi over 4, or my angle measure. We want to move 1 radius, or 1 unit out from that pole. So if I move 1 unit out from that pole, there's my point with radius 1, angle measure of 3 pi over 4. So that is my letter B. And again, you're going to want to plot that point. I'm going to go ahead and erase so that my picture doesn't become too cluttered as I go through and I do these. I'm ready to now move onwards and talk about letter C. Letter C says plot the point whose radius is -4 and whose angle measure is 135 degrees. Well, again, I'm going for that angle measure first. So 135 degrees, oh, it's going to be the same as that 3 pi over 4 that we were just working with. But what I want you to notice and pay really close attention to on this one is the fact that this radius is negative. What that tells us to do is go the opposite direction through the pole, or count the opposite direction through the pole. So rather than counting outwards on that ray that I just drew to represent 135 degrees, we are instead going to go in the opposite direction. So I am instead going to go now on that purple ray a distance of 4 units from the pole. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That, folks, would be my point C. So again, that important thing to notice with that one is that that negative radius tells us to go the opposite direction through the pole. Again, I'm going to erase here just to keep my picture clean and neat and tidy. You probably don't have these angles drawn in there. Letter D says plot the point with coordinates -3/2 and 5 pi over 6. So 5 pi over 6 is going to fall short of 6 pi over 6 by pi over 6. So there's my angle measure of 5 pi over 6. I want to go a distance of negative, or a radius of -3/2. So again, I'm going the opposite direction through that pole. And my radius here is 1.5. So there would be my point D. I'm going to erase again, trying to keep this neat. Letter E says -270 degrees. So -270 degrees now is going to move in a clockwise direction from that polar axis. So -270 degrees is going to put me right up here. And on that ray, we want to go 2 units from our pole. So there's our letter E. And then I'm going to erase one more time. And let's see what goodness lies in store for us with letter F. Letter F, we're going 2 pi over 3 for our angle. So let me go ahead and get that in there. There's 2 pi over 3. This time our radius is positive, so I'm just going to count out on that ray. 5 units. And there, folks, would be our letter F. Beautiful. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about on that page. I'm going to now scoot up to the top of page 7, zoom in a little bit. And we're going to talk about labeling these points in more than one way. Eventually tomorrow we're going to get into this by talking about different radiuses, but the focus of our discussion today is going to be all about the coterminal angles. Like I did on the first page, I'm going to go ahead and draw the angles in there just to keep your diagram clean and neat and tidy. You might want to just follow along as I do that, but not actually draw on your own polar axis. So for number 1, it says find one equivalent polar point for each of these. I'm going to go ahead and start. I've got a radius of 4, a degree measure of 15. So let me go ahead and get my pole on there, my polar axis. An angle measure of 15 degrees is going to be 15 degrees up from that polar axis. And I'm going to think about naming that angle in a slightly different way. Instead of going 15 degrees in a counterclockwise direction from that polar axis, I'm going to say what happens if I move in a clockwise fashion. Well, if I move in a clockwise fashion, I'm going to be approaching a full circle, or a full 360 degrees, but I'm going to fall short by 15 degrees, making the measure of that clockwise angle -335 degrees. So whereas one way to name that point would be with radius 4 and degree measure 15, a second way to name that point would be to name it with the same radius of 4, but with its coterminal angle moving in a clockwise direction of -300. I guess it's 345. Can't talk and do math at the same time. So let me go back and make that minor adjustment. And the one thing I really want to focus on or pay attention to is notice that those two angles here are coterminal angles. One that moves clockwise from that polar axis, the other of which moves counterclockwise. All right, so let me go get those out of there so that we can start afresh, have a clean slate to take a look at letter B. Letter B says our angle measure is 60 degrees. So let me go get that on there. There's 60 degrees. And I'm going to think about going to that same ray, but this time I'm going to go clockwise from my polar axis. And again, I'm going to be approaching a full complete 360 degrees, but falling short by that 60, making the measure of that angle negative 300. So again, same ray, I'm just getting there counterclockwise instead, sorry, I'm getting there clockwise instead of counterclockwise. I'm going to go ahead and use the same radius, but use the coterminal angle of 300 degrees. All right, and now when we want to actually plot that point, we understand that that negative angle means to go ahead and to reflect through the pole. So I'm going to go ahead and reflect through the pole, and on that reflection, count out 3 units. So there would be my letter B. All right, again, I'm going to erase to try to keep this as uncluttered as I possibly can. You should have on your page now a point A and a point B. I'll go back and write those in at some future date. Letter C says plot the point with radius 5 and angle measure 105 degrees. So again, I'm going to go for that angle measure first. So there's my angle whose measure is 105 degrees. And I'm going to focus now on going clockwise around my circle instead of counterclockwise until I hit that same ray. And again, I'm thinking about completing a full 360, but falling short by the 105. So 360 minus 105 tells me that they are negative 265 degrees in that rotation. Keep the same radius, but just rename that angle with its coterminal buddy, negative 265 degrees. And again, notice that every single one of these pairs always going to be coterminal angles. Once we found our angle, we want to count out 5 units and label that point C. Again, I'm going to erase. You're probably hopefully just watching me do this so that your picture doesn't get too cluttered. Letter D says plot the point with radius negative 4, angle measure pi over 2. I like this one. All right, so there's pi over 2 if I'm going in a counterclockwise fashion from that polar axis. If I go in a clockwise fashion to get to that same ray, I'm going to have to go minus 3 pi over 2. And again, there was my pi over 2. Together they make a complete 2 pi. So same radius, I'm just renaming the angle. Notice that when they give the angle measure to me in radians, I'm giving them the angle measure in radians, and likewise the same with the degrees. So we're not going to convert back and forth between radians and degrees. We're going to pick one and stick with it. The negative 4 on point D tells us we're going to count the opposite direction through that pole. So I'm going to count 4 units in the opposite direction and name that point D. All right, I'm going to clean this up so we can do our last 2. Number 5 says our angle is pi. Oh, I like this one too. So there's pi if I'm going counterclockwise. If I'm going clockwise, it's the same distance, but just negative pi units. So negative 6 comma pi would be my other name. Sorry, negative 6 comma negative pi. And because my radius is negative, I'm going to go the opposite direction from the pole, putting point E right there. All right, and then we're getting close to the finish line here. Point F is going to have an angle measure of 225. So again, if we're going clockwise, we're going a positive 225. If we're going to go hit that same ray going in a counterclockwise direction, it would be the 360 minus the 225, or a negative 135 degrees. Same radius of 5, but again, his coterminal buddy, negative 135 degrees. And this radius is positive, so I'm just going to count out on that ray. There, folks, is point F. All right, perfect. Last thing I want to talk about is number 7. It says find an equivalent polar point for point F where theta is between 0 and 180. All right, so let me go back and let me backtrack here. Notice that both of these angle measures for letter F, one of them is greater than 180, one of them is totally not even between 0 and 180. We want our theta to range between 0 and 180. So in other words, how could we name that point F? Well, I'm going to say that if we were headed on the opposite ray, so I'm just going to go ahead and reflect that right back up through the pole. So if we were to go end up on that blue ray, but instead of a positive radius, I counted a negative radius, well, that would end me right up at point F. So I'm simply going to go halfway around the circle, or subtract 180 from that 225, and subtracting 180 from that 225 is going to land me here at 45 degrees. So if I were to go 45 degrees, but with a negative radius, I would reflect through the pole and end up at that exact same point. All right, and I think for today that is a good job. Well done. So I'm going to stop here. If you have questions, you are always more than welcome to catch me by email. That'll work. You can put a note in Teams. That'll work. What I want you to do next with the remainder of your time in here today is to go and answer a few questions I've left for you in Delta Math. I don't know why I made that angle negative. Sorry, I'm going to go make that a positive 45 degrees. I am really not feeling good. Answer your questions in Delta Math. And then your homework is going to be on page 7, so the next page in the packet. Hopefully I'll be feeling better and be with you when I see you or in class tomorrow. If not, I'll probably have another video waiting for you. But again, please don't hesitate to reach out via email or through Teams.